Hello class, this is your lecture on plant names and classification. In this brief lecture, we're going to go over the following learning goals, including the development of binomial nomenclature, the development of the kingdom concept, and classification of major groups. In the past, plants were classified in various ways. For example, in the year 300 BC, Aristotle and his contemporaries started to classify plants by their form and function. Also, around this time and moving forward over about 1,000 years, many different cultures started to classify plants by medicinal use. Particularly the Chinese and the Greeks did a lot of work around classifying what these plants could be used for. One oddity from this time is Europe's doctrine of signatures, in which people thought that there were similarities in plant and human shapes that indicate what illnesses plants could treat. And of course, most of this turned out to be completely false, but surprisingly, a couple things actually were true. One that's completely false is the primitive plant called liverwort is not used to treat liver at all, but it was thought to treat liver disease since the surface of the plant looked like a liver. And this is one that actually was true. So the mandrake root actually contains some very toxic tropane alkaloids that can cause people to hallucinate and get violently sick. That's actually quite common for members of the nightshade family, that they contain these alkaloids. And so, because the root looks like a little person, it just kind of told a very unique story. So, move forward to about the 1700s, and that's when Linnaeus and his contemporaries really started to give names to everything. And Linnaeus was actually a Swedish botanist, and he shortened names to binomials in Latin, in which every organism had a scientific name that is composed of a genus plus a species name. And most of these names were given based upon reproductive parts. Many of these names are still used today with refinements. Now, one plant has the name Solanum lycopersicum, and that is the tomato that's very common and delicious. When the garden tomato was first observed, though, people were scared that it might be poisonous because it was known that many members of the nightshade family had these very poisonous fruits and parts. And so the scientific name of Lycopersicum actually means wolf peach, and it comes from German werewolf myths. These legends said that deadly nightshade was used by witches to transform themselves into werewolves, and so the tomato's similar but much, much larger fruit was called the wolf peach when it first arrived in Europe. So kind of a fun historical anecdote. So then flash forward to basically the last century, and that's when we started to develop the kingdom concept. So early classification schemes naturally classified all living organisms as either plant or animal. And this worked well for many organisms, but not for complex organisms, and certainly not for very simple organisms such as the archaea. In 1938, all single-celled organisms with prokaryotic cells were separated into Monera, but then in the 1990s, Monera was done away with and split into two separate groups, the archaea and the bacteria. And we currently have 6 kingdoms, and for the purposes of this class, we're going to follow a 6-kingdom system. But again, it depends on who you ask, because one of these kingdoms, the Protista, is actually an artificial designation. Based upon current research, the Protista could be exploded into multiple kingdoms over the next few years or decades. So we've got the archaea and bacteria, which are kingdoms that belong to the prokaryotic groups. And then we've got the Protista, That group, again, is kind of artificial in its designation, but for now it works. Photosynthetic organisms that belong to the algae are protists. And then we've got the fungus and the plants, and the group that humans and chimpanzees belong to, the animals. So in this class, we want to understand how biologists classify organisms based upon their common descent, which is to say based upon their shared common ancestry. And the fancy word for this is phylogenetics. It's the study of evolutionary relationships among species. Phylogenetic trees are diagrams that depict evolutionary relationships based on descent from common ancestors. A cladogram is a type of phylogenetic tree. For example, this cladogram shown on your screen shows the relationships of mosses to ferns to conifers to flowering plants. And as we go over evolutionary time, we can identify the common ancestor and the characteristics that that ancestor possessed. A clade is classified as a group of organisms consisting of a common ancestor and all of the descendants. A clade in this context is also referred to as a monophyletic group. We cannot refer to a group of species or organisms as a monophyletic group unless we can include all of the organisms found at the tips of these clades and the common ancestor. Tracing these taxa back to their common ancestor often reveals their evolutionary relatedness. Further, we can map characters on this tree of life that helps us sort out relationships. And in this instance, characters refers to the characteristics or traits that these organisms have. In this diagram, it shows us how we could break down from the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species level, where we start at the big plant kingdom and work our way all the way down to the common white potato, which has the genus Solanum and the species Tuberosum. All right. So in conclusion, we now understand the development of binomial nomenclature and the development of the kingdom concept and how we can break down these organisms into major groups based upon evolutionary relatedness. These flowers that you see on your screen belong to the genus Leptosiphon, and these are the flowers that I studied when I did my master's thesis. All right, that's it for today's very short lecture. Thank you for listening.